Hi, Richard Price, academia.edu. Just wondering what your thoughts are about the future of consumer software in respect of kind of business models. Do you think that they'll continue to be paid for consumer software, or do you think eventually in sort of 10, 15 years' time, everything will be kind of ad-supported?
No, I think we're going to have, I think advertising is an increasingly exciting opportunity, and a number of consumer applications, consumer experiences, will be ad-funded. At the same time, I don't think everything, I think a lot of things will be ad-funded. We have to all stop and say to ourselves, the average consumer really doesn't like to pay for things. And anything that can be ad-funded sensibly to the customer and sensibly to the provider will be. Let's just take that as a basic premise. And yet, are there experiences which are either too expensive to be delivered through advertising properly, or on the flip side, the advertising, what you would need to do for advertising is so invasive, so persistent, so painful that the user won't want them? And I think the answer to that is yes. So let me give some examples. Will basic internet connectivity be all ad-funded? I think the answer to that question, that's not a software question, it's a hardware question. You could say, I think the answer to that is no, it won't be. What's a good example? Will online publications be largely ad-funded as things move from the physical world to the online world? I think the answer is yes. Have we seen the migration of things even like email? Email itself directly, our Windows Live Hotmail, in and of itself, it doesn't generate that much ad revenue. So we've had to put essentially a whole portal around it because the traffic it brings is very valuable, but it's not very easily monetized in the context of mail. Google's had the same experience, even though they read your mail and we don't. I mean, right? That's just a factual statement, not even meant to be pejorative. The theory was if we read your mail, if somebody read your mail, they would know what to talk to you about. Well, it's not working as brilliantly as kind of the concept was laid out. So you really have to ask the question, where are the sources of monetization? Where do things make sense? And I think there will be some subscription businesses, and yet I think many, many things will move to be either ad-funded or essentially will move to be essentially not for profit. Let me use the example of Wikipedia. As formerly the world's largest encyclopedia vendor. It used to be other guys, and then we took the crown with Expedia, and now what we found is essentially the most popular encyclopedia in the world has no funding. It has no monetization model. You could sort of say it's got kind of an open source approach, but for content as opposed to software in this case. So I think we'll see a mix of things happen as sort of consumer applications and consumer software sort of morphs for this software plus services world.
Yeah, John Markwell, Anida Innovations. Are there any plans to bring your development tools like Visual Studio to other operating systems like Mac OS and Linux?
For hosting or for targeting?
For development work. So if I
actually have the development on those systems? No. I mean, obviously, with some of the stuff we showed you today, Silverlight is cross-platform. So from a Windows expression on a Windows workstation and Visual Studio on a Windows workstation, you can write code now that executes on a Mac or on a Linux machine. But for the actual development environment itself, there's no current plans. I mean, if there was a groundswell of demand and we actually thought we could sell the stuff, it's always unclear when people say there's a groundswell of demand for something in the Linux world, whether that means there's a groundswell of demand to make it free or a groundswell of demand to actually sell it in the Linux world. But at least currently, we don't have a plan. I don't think it's a very big opportunity for us. But if we don't get to some question today or you want to follow up, I'm Steve B. at Microsoft.com. That's my email address. So if you feel passionately there's a great mutual opportunity, send me a piece of mail.
Mary Harrington, School of Everything. You mentioned Wikipedia as being sort of open source in the content production context rather than technology. Given the bit of the kerfuffle that there's been around the new Microsoft platform, is it Vista? Sorry, I've forgotten. And digital rights management. I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about open source and the way in which content and development is opening out in a lot of circles, and how Microsoft is planning to engage with that.
Yeah, I think there'll be multiple business models for software and services in the future. We happen to believe in what I'll call a commercial model for us, because it's a little hard to, rent the office space here unless we have revenue, et cetera. But that doesn't mean there's sort of one model that inherits the earth. We're saying, as a commercial enterprise, we're engaged in commercial software. There'll be other people who choose, for whatever set of reasons and with whatever set of kind of business objectives, to engage in an open source approach. So what's our strategy? A, to compete. When we have products that have open source competitors, we need to offer better value. Our products need to have more capabilities. They need to be better supported. They need more applications. They need more device support. We have to compete where there's a direct overlap. Now, people focus a lot on Windows versus Linux or Office versus Open Office. Sure, we're competing. On the other hand, I'd also tell you the following is true. I would love to see all open source innovation happen on top of Windows. So we've done a lot to encourage, for example, the team building, PHP, the team building, many of the other open source components. I'd love to see those kinds of open source innovations proceed very successfully on top of Windows, because our battle is not sort of business model to business model. Our battle is product to product. Windows versus Linux, Office versus Open Office. The only other thing I would say that's probably germane is we spend a lot of money, the rest of the commercial industry spends a lot of money on R&D. We spend a lot of money also licensing patents. When people come and say, hey, this commercial piece of software violates our patent, our intellectual property, we'll either get a court judgment or we'll pay a big check. And we are going to, I think it is important that the open source products also have an obligation to participate in the same way in the intellectual property regime. That's why we've done the deal we have with Novell, where not only are we working on technical interoperability between Linux and Windows, but we've also made sure that we could provide the appropriate fee. Novell customers also get essentially the rights to use our patented intellectual property. And I think it's great the way Novell stepped up to kind of say intellectual property matters. People who use Red Hat, at least with respect to our intellectual property, in a sense, have an obligation eventually to compensate us. There are plenty of other people who may also have intellectual property. And every time an Aeolus comes to Microsoft and says, pay us, I suspect they also would like to eventually go to the open source world. So getting what I'll call an IP interop framework between the two worlds, I think, is important.